Thank you all so much for coming to a lecture about Southampton's post-war architecture. Yeah, not a lot of people can say they've done that. I'm beginning with this all-important question of what went wrong. Why it is that Southampton's architecture is held in such low esteem. I think it generally is. I think it's quite rare that you would come across anyone in or outside of Southampton who will have many kind words to say about the city's architecture. Occasionally, people will kind of point to the medieval heritage, maybe also the Georgian, but by and large, it's not something people are particularly proud of in this city. And when you look at the recent architecture, my God, it shows. So, given that it's a city that's historic, has always been very important, quite large, has a big university, should really be much, much better than it is. There really has to be a kind of attempt to answer the question of why it is as it is, how it is that West Quay came to happen in particular. I don't think it's ever really lived down West Quay. Anyway, but in many ways, the Sea City Museum itself is a place where you kind of wander around and think, what went wrong? It's obviously what they're talking about here in this particular exhibit from the Sea City Museum is the Titanic and what went wrong, i.e. how is it that it managed to sink, rather than being an enormous metaphor for hubris. The Sea City Museum is really, really sums this up. On one hand, the kind of very, very kind of pinched scale of it. The way that it's on the one hand, it kind of uses the stone cladding of the civic centre to try and be in keeping, but on the other hand, tries to do something a little bit different, therefore satisfying no one, neither being entirely modern, neither being entirely classical. The cheapness of the exhibits, the cheapness particularly of the architectural detailing, this might be a bit of an anal point, but if you go around inside the Sea City Museum and look at the ceiling, you'll see exactly what I mean. There are bits where you can see underneath the suspended ceilings that they put in there, little bits of the coffered ceiling from the Civic Centre, a Grade 1 listed building, you see little fragments of it, as if they've kind of got halfway to putting their crap suspended ceiling on it and thought, well, let's leave a little bit, just so you can get an idea that this once used to be a good building.
But that's exactly what they did, that was exactly the idea.
And also, how that particular architect managed to end up doing the Sea City Museum. Wilkinson Eyre, the firm that did this, they're not really architects, they're an engineering firm. They're very good at bridges. They've done some fantastic bridges. Gateshead, Millennium Bridge, by them, brilliant. Actual architecture, as in like buildings that have stuff in, is not really something they've ever really been good at. But however, they did design the Mary Rose Centre in Portsmouth. And I suspect that whoever let them do what they did at the Civic Centre had probably seen the Mary Rose Centre in Portsmouth. I always often get the impression that whoever runs these things in Southampton only goes to Portsmouth most of the time. We got something like Gunwharf. No, let's please not have something like Gunwharf. In many ways, the building kind of encapsulates that. And like lots of things in Southampton, it's fundamentally a monument to a disaster. Most of the Sea City Museum is about the Titanic. One of the several Titanic museums, or Titanic galleries. There's one in Liverpool where the ship was registered. There's one in Belfast where it was built, where you can buy T-shirts saying it was fine when it left us. The Belfast Titanic Centre is designed in the shape of an iceberg, incidentally. So at least there's some humour in that one. The question is what went wrong? Well, usually people will say Luftwaffe. That's the first answer, is the Luftwaffe. Well, it was great until November 1940, when in about a month, a huge wedge of the city centre was destroyed. This is a truth. This happened. An enormous quantity of Southampton was destroyed. Probably the biggest, among the biggest of any city in the country. Plymouth and Coventry and the east end of London are the only ones that approach the scale of destruction in Southampton. But then also if you look up what was there before, it wasn't that interesting. So that will explain why maybe it will explain why there's not that many old buildings, but it won't particularly explain the question of quality. The other thing that people will usually say is, well, the planners. They might then quote Prince Charles, who said an oft-quoted line that, well, you can give this to the Luftwaffe, at least they've only replaced what they destroyed with rubble, and instead replaced it with terrible concrete monstrosities, monstrous carbuncles, as the Prince called them. So the main point of this really is to contest that second bit. Actually, I think that those monstrous carbuncles were, in many ways, the most interesting things that happened architecturally in Southampton since the 18th century. Whereas the real culprit, I think, the real what went wrong, is something that happened in the 1980s, when Southampton started building shopping mall after shopping mall after shopping mall. This will be the sort of gist of it. So an attempt at apologism for the 50s, 60s and 70s, followed by an attempt to indict the 80s, 90s and 2000s. So to start with, there was, in the recent Southampton city plan, I can't remember who the planners were, this came out a couple of years ago. Southampton does not have a strong architectural character. Now, they should have been sacked instantly for that, I think. Southampton has a very strong architectural character, usually defined by these three things, or rather four. The first thing is obviously the medieval walls. Most complete of any city outside of York. Very, very interesting, very unusual, atmospheric, particularly in the bit around this end of town. Fascinating in general, and quite unique. Also, the 18th and early 19th sort of Georgian and Regency heritage of Southampton is also, although a bit more generic, is very much of a high quality and of quite a distinctive character as well. The bow windows that you see in lots of the central town, in particular, these are very, very distinctive. Less so maybe the Georgian stuff around Bedford Place, which is more like Georgian stuff anyway. But this sort of stuff is quite high quality. In his book Modern Architecture of 1930, the German architect Bruno Taub actually printed pictures of this stuff as examples of the sort of ideas that modern architecture come from. It was to return to 18th century values of lack of ornament, lots of light and air, big windows, curves, repetition, a sense of architecture as a sort of unified composition rather than a series of individual monuments. And this was actually the first major book published on modern architecture in Britain. And the third thing is Victorian Southampton. This is Netley, so I'm cheating a bit, but I think we can regard it as Greater Southampton. Probably the most interesting Victorian structure in the Southampton area was the Netley Hospital, and of course there's only one bit of it left. Philip Bour's book Spike Islands, if any of you have read it, you'll know, and if those of you who haven't read it, you should. It's excellent on this building, and many, many stories around it. Generally, Victorian Southampton isn't that interesting, I don't think. Not that great a Victorian city. Odd little interesting buildings, the Joiners being one of them, but Prudential, a couple of other things, but generally not that much. Southwestern Hotel is the other one that people bring up. The area in which Southampton became an important city and went from being initially a sort of medieval port and then a spa town, and then in the late Victorian era it starts becoming an important port. But the area in which it becomes very important and becomes for a time probably the most important port in the country is the interwar years. This was probably Southampton's kind of apogee, as it were, of wealth and power, largely because of the fact that the White Star Line in Cunard relocated from Liverpool to Southampton, meaning that most transatlantic shipping was going from Southampton. If you wanted to get to New York, you went from Southampton. You didn't go from Liverpool anymore. Not particularly good on Liverpool. Lots of Liverpool's own history is predicated on this. Everything was fine until Southampton took all our shipping. Whereas Southampton itself meant a certain kind of influx of wealth and also an influx of population. And unfortunately, this happened at probably one of the more boring eras of British architecture. The interwar years in Britain were, with a couple of exceptions in bits of London, were very, very traditional as compared to what was happening on the continent. So the main kind of monuments of that era are probably, on the one hand, the civic centre, and in many ways the fact that Southampton doesn't have many of the kind of civic buildings that you find in lots of other cities, because they're all concentrated in just one big complex. I'm not been quite entirely convinced whether that's a good or a bad thing, but it means that there's just this one mammoth thing that all of civic Southampton has happened in, constructed in the 30s of this steel-framed tower in a sort of vague classical style. In terms of what else got built in that decade, a few cinemas and so forth, but mainly lots and lots of garden suburb housing, influenced by Ebenezer Howard's book Garden Cities of Tomorrow, in which he claimed that he invented something that was neither city nor country, but better than both. And there's both middle class and working class versions of that. The middle class version, which architecturally is a lot better, is Herbert Collins's various estates in Swavelin and in Highfield, which very much, if you go to somewhere like Hampstead Garden Suburb or Letchworth and these places, it's very, very similar, this kind of weird sort of fantasy land, very, very prisoner. It's the place where number 6 would be wandering around thinking, where am I? The illusion's very nicely done in those. You wouldn't know they were built in the 20s unless you know. Whereas the lower end of the social scale, there was the Flower Estate, the largest of the interwar estates in Southampton. And the Flower Estate is very interesting compared as a way of comparing everything that post-war architecture wanted not to be. The Flower Estate, you have very big gardens, but you walk around the streets, you'll notice there are no trees. The actual public spaces are just asphalt. There's a big park, there's Daisy Dip, there's a big park in the middle, that's got some trees, and there's very, very big gardens, but public space is the least important thing about the Flower Estate. The entire point of it is this sort of private space, this sort of backyard that you will tend. Initially, they actually thought that people would grow their own vegetables in the Flower Estate. That was the thing. And they were very much aimed at the deserving poor at the time. Rents were fairly high for working class housing. They were not anyone could get a flat in the Flower Estate. It's just ironic for any of you that know the Flower Estate today. So there's at least 2 places here I've lived in, but I'm not going to tell you which. So this then, this quite prosperous but quite boring city is completely flattened, or at least the city centre is completely flattened in November 1940, and interesting things happen at that point. People get quite pissed off. You get this idea that everyone's sort of, well, all in this together, and all this sort of bollocks, but actually it caused a lot of tension in Southampton. A lot of people left. A lot of people just went and slept in a new forest. People that had family outside the estate. The city council's leaders all did a runner for most of November. And the RAF actually mounted a coup in the city and ran it in the absence of the city council for a time. Little known fact. This is all in Tom Harrison's book, Living Through the Blitz, which is a compilation of mass observation research from the time, people's surveys, people's diaries, interviews that they'd done at the time. And after Southampton had been particularly pelted with bombs, the king came and visited. And one of Harrison's interviewees from 1940 says, well, it's all very nice that he's come and come to see us, but I'd really rather have a house. So, this was, in many ways, I think, the fact that Southampton is one of the very, very few Labour voting parts of the south of England may be partly put down to that. I know that Itchen has a Tory MP right now, that's an anomaly. I think partly it may come from that. Partly it comes from the fact that it's a civilian port and there's not much military, there's various other factors. But I think also that shock in 1940 and noticing that your betters did a runner may have had an effect. So there are little bits of war memorials, obviously, in Southampton, Holy Rood Church being the most obvious of them. But initially it kind of rebuilt fairly quick. And the results of that aren't much fun. For most of this period, the sort of this is going roughly 45 to about 85, or at least the booklet does. Southampton had a Labour council, so this is who we praise or blame for most of it. Anyway, the above bar is really the first thing that happens, and above bar is a sort of ad hoc thing. Initially, there's this very grand Beaux-Arts plan of grand boulevards and squares, and there's going to be double height like the roads in Chester, if you know them. It was going to be this quite grand and pompous neoclassical city. That's what was going to happen. If you go to Le Havre, actually, you'll see something quite similar to what the initial post-war plan of Southampton was. In the end, they decided this would be too expensive and too fancy, and they'd have to buy up lots of land to do it, and so above bar happened. Described by Nicholas Pevsner in the Buildings of England as being like a Midwestern town with Portland stone and planning control. Very kind of vague prairie kind of thing. It's kind of 1-2-story buildings just going on very, very boringly. So, if you want interesting architecture in post-war Southampton, commerce is not the place. There's not a lot of good office blocks, there's not a lot of good shops, not a lot of good cinemas. This is really not what happens. This isn't the case everywhere. There's plenty of bits of the country where interesting stuff happens for these functions. Southampton, no. Southampton, the main interest is housing and public buildings. And the first of these is the Kingsland Estate, or Cossack Green as my mum calls it. I don't know if anyone else calls it Cossack Green. One of the streets is called Cossack Green. This was the first project of the new city architect. The first time Southampton appointed a city architect who assembled behind a very, very large department. There were a few dozen people working by the late 50s under Berger. He was from Liverpool, another steal from Liverpool. And actually, post-war Southampton has much, much better housing than Liverpool, probably for that reason. We stole their architects and their shipping. Kingsland Estate is quite similar to a lot of the sort of stuff that was going on in continental Europe in the 20s and 30s. It's very, very like the kind of Bauhaus housing being built in Germany, like the De Stijl in the Netherlands. This kind of low-rise, white walls, kind of quite clever geometries, very kind of clean and clipped, machine-made style. But with lots of greenery and trees kind of interspersed around it. Probably the best of all of these. They kind of got it right the first time, I think, in many respects. And also, like a lot of the post-war stuff in Southampton, it's in a city. A lot of cities have policies of moving people out of the city centre, and this never really happened in Southampton. After Kingsland Estate, you have two more quite big inner city housing schemes. This one gets particular praise from Nicholas Pevsner in the Buildings of England, where he calls it a first-rate piece of urban development. Northern also had the first tower block in Southampton. Most of Northern Estate was built in the late 50s, around 57, 58. And for inner city housing, at the time, it would have seemed extremely unusual. That, you know, you could still see little fragments of this in the rest of Northern. But most of the city housing, there was no trees, no greenery, you know, buildings kind of built in straightforward rows. Northern, you have houses, flats. Northern Estate, you had these kind of Y-shaped blocks, sort of L-shaped blocks, with quite big green spaces going in between, replacing private gardens, which were not part of the programme, and oriented towards the sun. If you've been in any of these flats, you'll know, you know, the kind of effect that orientation has. So it would have, at the time, seemed quite revolutionary, something that's now quite difficult to recapture. If you go to Holyrood Estate, you'll see something not hugely dissimilar, a lot less green. Holyrood, you're a bit closer to the city centre, and it's a bit tighter, and there's less in the way of greenery. But there's a similar thing in kind of light and air and openness. One of the really key things about Southampton's post-war housing programme is that they never at any point got in the system builders. And this is a really, really, really key question. Lots of the stuff that's worst remembered, lots of stuff that's had to be demolished across the country is stuff which, rather than being dealt with by architects, was largely dealt with by volume house builders. Usually the sorts of places that are still doing very well nowadays, Taylor Woodrow, Wimpey, Bernadis, etc. They had housing kits, basically. You would kind of prefabricate and system build a tower. And they tended to be a little bit dodgy. The most famous of them, this is quite exceptional, but it still sums up quite a few things, was Ronan Point in the East End of London, which used a Danish kit that was supposed to go up to 8 stories, which it got up to 22. The insulation was newspaper, and a gas explosion killed 8 people in May 1968, and about one side of the building collapsed. Various other system-built buildings in Yorkshire in particular had to be demolished as early as the late 1970s because they were so badly built. Portsmouth also built lots of system-built housing, which they've had to get rid of, such as Portsdown Park. It's usually a good way of convincing people something is good in Southampton if you say that Portsmouth did the opposite. So I'm hoping that has an effect. Southampton, as well as not getting in the systems, also had a programme of getting in outside architects. You know, they would basically scour the architecture magazines, pick who they thought was interesting, and get them to build stuff. So these two are examples of housing that was built by quite famous and respected architects of the day, building council flats. Wyndham Court, you will all obviously know well, was designed by the firm Lyons Israel Ellis, who had sort of finishing school for lots of later famous architects like James Stirling, Alistair B. Smithson, Lee Brown, people that they wanted to do very, very large-scale, prestigious projects across the world, in many cases. And this, I think, is probably the best building that firm ever did. Castle House, designed by Eric Lyons, who largely designed sort of upper-middle-class housing in Blackheath, Cambridge, an entire new town called New Ash Green, and Kent, which is a very, very weird place indeed. And both of these buildings were prestige projects. The materials were of very high quality, particularly at Castle House. If you go to Castle House and look up close, you will see exactly what I mean. I think even someone that hates modern architecture, you could take them to Castle House and go, look at that. That cost a lot of money, and they would understand. Wyndham Court, it's a bit harder to tell because of the fact they never fucking clean it. But if they did, it would be obvious the concrete is of very high quality. It's very similar to the concrete at the National Theatre in London, which does get cleaned. Both of these were, I think, very much of, about a sort of declarative presence, about going, you are here. Something that Southampton architecture is very much lost. The kind of you could be anywhere. There's much more the feeling of much of it. And they sort of evoke certain certain aspects of Southampton's history, I think, without being historicist, without, Castle House doesn't try and look like a castle. But if you look at it, in conjunction with the city walls, you get that same sort of sense of these sort of walls rising into a central building. And that central building being what the council house, I think, is like a very good thing. Similarly, Wyndham Court, a building which I've always thought has a sort of cruise ship or battleship-like quality. I don't know if that's fanciful, but I've always got that impression. And placed very much directly outside the station, in this kind of like, you have arrived at Southampton. Here is our very over-the-top Brutalust building. A quality which the recent flats next to it really do not have. It was housing. Housing was definitely the kind of main bulk of Southampton City Council's post-war projects. There was also a lot of public buildings, and most of them have disappeared. The housing has mostly been retained. There's been very little demolition. I think a little bit in Town Hall Park, but mostly all that was built in the 60s is still there. So it's with the other public buildings. It's with the parks, the schools, particularly the schools, the swimming baths, and also the ocean terminal, which is very old. That those have sort of disappeared one by one, generally through replacing nothing much. So Mayflower Park, obviously. Mayflower Park is one of pretty much only two places in the entire city of Southampton where there is public access to the water. Now that should be completely insane, right? It's a port. There's two bits where you can actually get a sense of that. Both Riverside Park and Mayflower Park are projects of the 60s, both projects of the City Council Archivist under Leon Burgess. Architecturally, Mayflower Park is a more interesting one too, particularly for these fantastic shelters, which in many ways, apart from Wyndham Court, if I had like one building in post-war Southampton that kind of means most to me, it'd probably be those shelters. I think they're wonderful things, like kind of little sort of medieval versions of Frank Lloyd Wright. Wonderful. A couple of years ago, the roofs were taken off. I don't know, presumably to stop kids drinking cider or something like that. I don't know, whatever kids do nowadays. But I cannot otherwise fathom why they were taken off, therefore completely ruining them as architecture. And I think that's a real example of the kind of baffling lack of esteem that the City Council seems to have for all of this stuff. They didn't seem to know it was good, which is furious. The Central Baths, 72,000 in my day. Quite similar sense of sort of scale and grandeur, actually. That to many of the more famous post-war buildings, like the Royal Festival Hall in London, the Belgrade Theatre in Coventry, these very kind of proud public buildings. And weirdly, the Central Baths was just gotten rid of in the late 90s after being. So architecture was trouble with that. And the Ocean Terminal. The Ocean Terminal is one of the strangest of all of these things. It has the least to do, in many ways, with this kind of, by the post-war, with a generally quite sort of rigorous and austere post-war modernism of Southampton. Actually, it was a quite glamorous building, as you can kind of see with this, this sort of stuff and all of this sort of ocean liner glamour to it. It was opened in 1951 by Clement Attlee, and later used by the likes of Liz Taylor and John Lennon, who mentions it in the Ballad of John Wood. And weirdly, this building just got kind of swept out of the way for Ocean Village. Not, I think, fair exchange. Probably the most consistently good modern architecture in the city, though, is actually in the university. And the university is actually the only place where they've continued to build good stuff, which pains me to say it, actually. but they have. The bus shelters built quite recently, in particular. If you know the ones, I mean the wooden bus shelters. Really, really nice, subtle little piece of design. So they can still do it. Why none of the rest of the city can, I don't know. Here you kind of get a little. This is just a fragment of the Student Union with sculptures by Barbara Hepworth. I can't remember what that is, engineering, I think. And it's round the corner from the Flower Estate, and I recommend, if you want to know what makes post-war architecture different from pre-war, go to the Flower Estate and then walk to the university. And I think it would be very, very difficult for anyone not to then see the point of modernism and why it happened. Whereas everything in the Flower Estate is about private space, in the university everything is about public space. Everything is about this rolling green space that flows through the whole thing, and the kind of clusters of trees and so forth, and the complete public access to everything, which you can see also in the northern estate. The sense that nothing is gated, nothing is a full stop, that you can just walk through the whole thing. This was considered by the 1980s to encourage crime, and in many cases gates were then put on. In the university, it was never considered to encourage crime, and so there are no gates. So you get much more of a sense of that flowing space than you can anywhere else. And you can also have wonderful sculptures left through it, wonderful mix of different things. You have the theatre, the Nuffield Theatre, I think, particularly superb building. And it works really, really, really well. And you get the sense of, rather than the city being insular, of a city being a kind of outward-looking thing. The buildings are largely designed by Basil Spence, designed of Coventry Cathedral and the University of Sussex, who was knighted for his work on Coventry Cathedral, although when asked, that's later Hyde Park Barracks, what are you going to say to the Queen when she visits? He said, I'm going to run like hell. Anyway, he was generally a very, very interesting architect, and liked the area and built himself a home in Bewley, which is not really part of the story because I haven't managed to get to it. But from pictures, it's actually quite an interesting interpretation of lots of the ideas behind Southampton Uni. It's these big cantilevers over quite wild green space. So. Well, although a lot of what happened in Southampton was a matter of inner city housing, there was also a lot of suburbia. So, on the one hand, there were things like Shirley Estate, St Mary's Estate, or Golden Grove, depending on which you want to call it. Northern Holyrood, these very, very big inner city estates. But also, there were entire new suburbs built. Lord's Hill, Town Hall Park, and also the two that I think generally regarded as being, the moment where the city council stopped being good at this stuff, Millbrook and Thornhill. I was once told, although it's not really verifiable, that the city council had a policy of its architects living in the stuff they designed. And this worked everywhere except for Millbrook. None of the architects department wanted to live in Millbrook. But they did live in all the other stuff. And that's really, really worth remembering. This was not some sort of dehors en bas kind of like, we're building some stuff for the proles and then we go back to our Georgian houses. They had the courage of their convictions. But probably the most interesting of those post-war suburbs, for me anyway, is Western Shore, simply because of how completely bizarre it is. Actually, there's not really anything else like Western Shore anywhere in the country. It's sort of weird, sort of sci-fi landscape, I think. I'm quite sure that's not the generally held view. I don't know, but it very much feels like that to me. Now, that whole stretch of Southampton Water is sort of something out of J.G. Ballard, really. So on the one hand, you have on this side you have these towers kind of stepping down towards the shore with the 1930s shelters in front and the notoriously polluted beach at the end of it, where you can have a paddle if you don't mind paddling in the water of oil refinery. And across the road from it, you have the refinery, which at night you will know has sort of Blade Runner-like quality, and Fawley Power Station, which I'm told the 20th Century Society are currently trying to get listed, which would be wonderful if it happened. This, like all the others apart from the black and white ones, is my pictures, and I'm not a great photographer, and so you can't see the control room, which is the best bit of Fawley Power Station. It's in the booklet. This kind of fantastic sort of suspended flying saucer design. It's an incredibly interesting spot for kind of strange architecture and strange landscape. And I think very much enhanced by the fact that you have things like Netley Abbey, kind of in the middle of it. It's sort of very peculiar sort of Gothic modernist places. Anyway, I like it a lot. But there's also, you can start to see in places like this what started going wrong. That particularly in Millbrook and Thornhill, things that work really well in the inner city don't work as well as at the suburban scale. That if you're in Northern, going from the kind of density and kind of pollution of Northern into somewhere that's very, very green and you can hear birds singing and there's lots of trees, that's quite refreshing. If you're in somewhere like Millbrook and you're out in the middle of nowhere, going towards the New Forest, that starts to become not something that's kind of an escape, but is actually kind of just a sort of vague placelessness. And Millbrook, I think, has always been criticised on that basis. The book Soft City by the travel writer Jonathan Raban has a chapter on Millbrook. I found somewhat to my amazement when I first read that book when I was about 18. Because of the fact that his dad, who was the rector of Southampton, had been moved there to work in a church there. He kind of went there and thought, oh my God, what on earth is this? Anyway, he claims in there that Millbrook breeds criminals, not revolutionaries, which is a ridiculously snobbish statement, but anyway. But there's, this is a period in which both Southampton and Portsmouth were expanding massively. And I once gave a lecture in Portsmouth on the concept of the Solent city. I was trying to convince them it was a good idea and it would have been better off if they had been colonised by us. And they weren't so keen. And actually, it was Portsmouth's resistance more than Southampton's that stopped the Solent city from happening. For those of you that don't know, the Solent city was a plan that was commissioned by Harold Wilson's Labour government in 1966, carried out by the town planners Colin Buchanan and partners, to basically transform Southampton and Portsmouth into one city. They were going to build a town in the middle between the two that would link them. And this whole ensemble was going to be called the Solent City, or the Southampton Portsmouth Super City at one point. And this would have had a population of like 850,000, would have been very, very big, very, very powerful, because both of these cities at that point were expanding economies, expanding populations, lots of people were moving there. And developers were building lots and lots of stuff in the spaces between the two cities and the spaces around them. Like, a lot was getting built. And the government essentially decided, okay, let's try and control this, let's try and plan it, rather than just let it happen. The idea, I think, pissed people off so much that it never really happened in the end. What happened was entirely unplanned, and what they feared in the 60s actually happened. But I think this is one of the, I think, fairly typical fragment of the Solent city. This is the central precinct in Chandler's Ford. It's sort of slightly Newtown-like. I think Chandler's Ford is probably one of the nearest things to a new town around the Solent. It's got a similar vibe to bits of like Stevenage and Basildon and so on, bits of Milton Keynes, but much, much, much vaguer. Those all have much more of an effort at the centre, which Chandler's Ford never really bothered with. This is about as far as they got. But the really, really key point behind the Solent city is that it happened. That many people did move to the spaces between Southampton and Portsmouth. If you look at the EU statistics on this, the EU's kind of definition of urban regions, they have Southampton and Portsmouth together as the 6th largest city in the country, with a population of 850,000. And And if you go through that huge urban area, it's only really in the centre of Southampton, the centre of Portsmouth, that you know you're in a city. And so it was, this was really their failure. And I think this is worth remembering, that when you have a kind of, a plan that you don't particularly like, it's always worth trying to argue for a better plan rather than argue for no plan at all. Because if you don't, you let Barratt homes do what they like. The other place where I think the rot starts setting in is in the massive road building that happens in Southampton from the 1960s onwards. So all of this effort goes into planning housing estates and public spaces in certain areas in Northern, and then they're cut off from the city centre by an enormous dual carriageway, almost kind of undoing all the effort they're making, immediately kind of giving them a sense of isolation that actually in terms of distance they don't really have. But because of the fact that you have this kind of physical barrier, people feel that they have a distance. And a really big mistake. Largely done, I think, because of the actual economy of Southampton, what it actually was. They plough all these roads through and have not really stopped ploughing roads through in order to get stuff to and from the port. And that's why you get stuff like this. This is the first of the Southampton malls, really. And I think this is not something that just starts in the 80s with Thatcherism and postmodernism and so on. It's actually one of the nastiest sides of the modernist era that then they kind of run with. And so East Street, I think, is the start. And after East Street, you have the deluge. The total failure of architectural nerve that happens after that is really something to behold. It's going to get depressing, sorry. So the first of these is Ocean Village. And then probably the most important thing that happens in Southampton, and that makes it into the city it is now, is containerisation. I'll come back to that bit at the end, but I think that's really crucial. But it goes from having this very intensive, working class environment, with large quantities of unskilled jobs, to that being done away with almost within a decade. And the former Eastern docks, where the Titanic went from, and so on and so forth, and where the ocean terminal was, that these gradually become disused, and the Western docks become the port that we all know now. Leaving a very large space with which they did bugger all. And one of the most frustrating things about Southampton from the 80s onwards is they keep being given these fantastic sites with beautiful panoramic views of the water and so forth, and then they sod them up. And Ocean Village is the first and possibly the worst of them. Westview is the worst. It's the second worst. And here I think you can really get a sense of what the problem is with Ocean Village. That apart from bits of the housing, none of it's really designed around the water. It's designed around the car park. It's just these kind of pavilions in vague kind of spaces of asphalt and nothingness, designed in a kind of ingratiating, slightly neo-Victorian style, as if to kind of stop people from noticing how shoddy it all was. Most of it's banks, plus initially the very weird shopping mall that was Canute's Pavilion, which was at least kind of fun, and was replaced with more recent sort of New Labour style yuppie flats. But again, you have this fantastic site that they just missed. And initially this was going to be connected to the centre of Southampton with Alan Whitehead's monorail. Does anyone remember this? This was a real idea. There's a brochure. If you go to the Central Library and ask for the brochure on the monorail, it exists. It's not just from The Simpsons. It's actually real. There are pictures of like a monorail going outside the Royal Pier, really. And obviously that never happened. I think they probably looked at the Docklands Light Railway in London and thought, let's have one of those. But they forgot the fact that only London ever gets transport funding in Britain. So it never happened. And after that, you have Town Quay, probably an even better site that is similarly kind of, covered in tap. A place where you could go and get T-shirts made, and there are lots of Magic Eye paintings for sale in Town Quay in the 1990s. And a similar kind of neo-Victorian design. At least on Town Quay you could get a bit of a sense of the water. That's probably the only thing that could be said for it. But other than that, it was pretty poor. But not nearly as poor as this. This is the point really where I think it goes from like well-meaning ineptitude to outright corruption. Stuff that people should have been sacked for, basically, starts to happen at this point. The people at the council who let this happen should not have kept their jobs. Leisure World was initially a warehouse. It was a big container warehouse, automated container warehouse. You can still see little hints of that on the facade. A warehouse with a multiplex in and a Frankie and Benny's, and a huge car park. And next to that, this delightful neo-Victorian pub. It could almost be in the 19th century. So there they really bad. And at this point, I think at this one, especially on the bracket. Oh well, I'll stay on that for a bit. The key point with this really is the other side of 1930s Southampton, which is a huge bit of reclaimed land, which was kind of taken from Southampton Water in that decade. The main thing built on it at that point is the Southampton flour mill, and then later the Pirelli's works, the power station. This became a very, very heavy industrial area right in the centre of town. And I think because of the fact that it was a heavy industrial area in the centre of town, meant that when it was replaced with what it was replaced with, people kind of shrugged their shoulders and were like, well, it wasn't very good there before anyway. Which really not good enough to say that it was crap before, so it doesn't matter if it's crap now. Also, some of the buildings were quite interesting. If you go to similar kind of sites, such as the floating harbour of Bristol, you find pretty similar buildings to those that were in that big reclaimed area. Sort of low-rise, post-war, light industrial buildings and dock buildings and so on, which got reused. The 1950s power station in Southwark became Tate Modern. The 1950s power station outside Southampton Central Station became Toys R Us. And what sort of that then happens is that then there was Western Esplanade and then there was West Quay. And Western Esplanade, and the hotels and so forth around it. This is really unusual stuff to get in the city centre. Like it's a kind of motorway landscape around it. Huge car parks, gigantic kind of retail sheds, no public space whatsoever. I'm always shocked as to the way when people walk from the old town to the central station, that people will walk round that kind of dead zone around the back of Asda and the coach station and so on, and they're walking that. A lot of it's not even lit, and it's the main way of getting from A to B. This is just a monumental failure of planning, and it also reveals the secret, I think, of all of this. What the real secret is, why it is that they built Hedge End on against the city walls. Why it is that this managed to happen, I think, is because of the fact that after containerisation and the gradual deindustrialisation of Southampton, the closure of Bosphorus, the more recent closure of ports, that of course there were certain things still happening in the Southampton economy, the university creating lots of tech jobs and so forth, but you did have the major problem of like, okay, what does Southampton exist for now? The port is automated, all of these jobs have disappeared. What are we going to do? Lots of people to the area around Southampton and Portsmouth. You had loads of people in suburban areas that didn't really have much of a centre, who quite like the idea of coming in somewhere and doing their shopping. Quite like the idea of being a John Lewis nearby. Quite like the idea of there being a city nearby. And because of the fact that you had all these already existing transport links to the docks, it was very, very easy to drive in from Bishop's Waltham, shop in John Lewis, and bugger off. And the entire city centre economy of Southampton, I think, apart from the bar and pub economy, started to be geared towards that and only that. If you look at George Monbiot's book, Captive State, written around the time that West Quay is being built, he actually manages to interview Paul Jenks, then head of the council, questions him about the fact that at the point that West Quay is being built, they have all this regeneration money for St Mary's, and the first thing that starts to do is demolish Kingsland Market. And he says, look, they have this plan to keep the market and do all of these interesting things, why don't you want to do that? And Jenks says, listen, you've been to St Mary's. Do you think people from Winchester are going to drive in to shop in St Mary's? That was all they used to know. So that, I think, is, so really the culprit behind all of this, in many ways, is the containerisation of the port and the automation of the port, and the fact that Southampton, unlike somewhere like Liverpool, didn't stop being a port. Liverpool doesn't really have much tonnage or shipping anymore. It's not really. You could be in Liverpool or in the east of London and not know you're in a port anymore. You could never not know that in Southampton. Anywhere you look in the centre, you can see those containers over there. You know it's there. But the people go in and they go out, just like they do in West Quay. No one stays. And so you have this, the landscape of a container port. The point of it really is that it's interchangeable, is that it could be anywhere. That's how it works so well. That's how you have managed to have this complete automated thing with very, very little human labour. And the city, I think, in many ways has started to follow suit. That it's sort of become an extension of that sort of nothingness, that place that's populated largely by commodities and not much else. But it's also, in terms of architecture, that I'm stretching the term here, probably the most interesting things to have happened here since the 60s. Particularly at night, but any time really, the spectacle of the container port, I think, is quite astonishing. The sheer scale of the automation and the mechanisation of it is remarkable. And it sort of suggests quite interesting things. Here you have something that used to involve loads and loads of labour and loads of drudgery that's just basically done by machines. It's actually an enormously futuristic space. At the moment, all those machines are used for getting stuff to and from John Lewis, or used to get in the commodities made in China and distribute them around the country. But whether or not there's something in this that's more interesting, it suggests a different kind of modernity and modernism to the one that we've got here now, is something worth thinking about and exploring. And on that completely vague and